Good morning. My name is Allison Arnold. I am the Agriculture Extension Agent here with the Cooperative Extension Service in Buncombe County, and I'll be your host today. We want to welcome you to Gardening in the Mountains Pollinator Habitat, Conservation and Restoration in Your Garden. I want to welcome our speaker today, Brian Tompkins. Brian grew up exploring swamps and forests near Milledgeville, Georgia, and has worked the past 15 years as a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service here in Asheville, as the recovery biologist for the federally endangered rusty-patched bumblebee. Brian wears another hat as the energy project coordinator for the Asheville field office, where he reviews energy projects such as hydropower, coal combustion, natural gas, solar, and wind farms. And he combines these two hats and coordinates with the energy companies how to protect threatened and endangered species and their habitats from the impacts associated with their energy production projects. Now, his recent efforts have been focused on the conservation of pollinator species with an emphasis on preservation and restoration of native pollinator habitat in North Carolina. Brian's a founding member of the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance and an active member of the Asheville Bee City Leadership Committee. And we're so excited to have Brian here to talk to us today about his experience with pollinator habitats. So take it away, Brian.
Hey, thanks, Allison. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. And thanks everybody for joining today. It is a beautiful day and I'm grateful for you to hang out with me for a little bit and talk pollinator conservation. And maybe after this, we can get out and enjoy World Bee Day. And it's also Endangered Species Day, the World Bee Day proclamation from the UN, protecting bees around the world, 20,000 different bee species. So get out and check out the flowers and see what you see. Again, I'm Brian Tompkins. I'm a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I've been wanting to put this presentation together for a while. I do a lot where we kind of give an overarching look at pollinator conservation and the reasons they're declining and things like that. But there's few presentations out there that really go into the nuts and bolts of getting habitat on the ground. Once I started putting this together, I found that this really probably should be a workshop. There's a lot of information in this presentation, and there's some things that we'll skip, that we'll kind of be glazing over, but please ask questions when you have them. If you do have questions, I'll stop periodically through the presentation and ask for questions. You're also welcome to type questions into the chat box, and Allison will manage those and break in and ask me those whenever we get a chance. At the same time, I wanted to tell everybody a secret tip. If something pops up on your screen and it's a slide that has information that you think is valuable or that you would like, you can always hit Control Print Screen, and that'll capture that screen and you can copy and paste it into a Word document or something like that. Pollinators are the unsung heroes of most ecosystems. They've been getting a lot more praise in recent years, but as we know, they are declining. One thing we have to do, though, is prioritize pollinator and pollinator habitat conservation. From planners to developers, renters to residential homeowners, private citizens to public agencies, nearly everyone has an opportunity to help pollinators in some way. Some efforts are simple and straightforward, while other solutions require a more fundamental shift in our traditional thoughts of vegetative beauty and what we consider to be acceptable landscape practices. We will need to start considering planning and creating our surroundings with an idea of functionality for wildlife, with components for healthy habitat for wildlife and pollinators, instead of the traditional landscaping values that include expansive non-native grass lawns and non-native plants that really provide very little more than maybe some pretty flowers and a nice even lawn. Some examples of that, we've got to look at ordinances and things in homeowner groups that require mowing, that require certain typically non-native species to be planted in yards. These are all important, and pollinator conservation starts with each of us and will require a wide range of actions, big and small. Arguably, the most important is pollinator habitat creation, restoration, and preservation. Pollinator habitat conservation can be accomplished on any scale through the landscape. So don't ever think that your yard is too small or too big or too overgrown or things like that. Some of you may be asking, what exactly is pollinator habitat? What's this guy talking about? It consists of three main components, and it's things that most of us have learned in basic biology classes. Those main components of pollinator habitat are food resources, nesting, sheltering, and overwintering areas. And one thing I've done for this presentation is I've broken down that shelter into the nesting and overwintering as well. And then lastly, we have water. Because the creation and enhancement of pollinator habitat is one action that many of us can take and immediately make a difference with on-the-ground implementation, I want to take some time today and go through exactly how we implement these on the landscape. And some of this will go into some deep detail. And like I said, some of it I'm depending on questions. I've wanted to put this together for a while. And this is my first time giving this presentation. So I'm going to be learning as much from you today as you are from me, hopefully, in how to make this presentation better through your questions and information that I might add. Please don't hold back on questions or comments, even at the end of this presentation. So how do we do pollinator habitat? And what are we looking for? Well, one of the first things that you really should do as you go out into your area is conduct a pollinator habitat assessment. Using those three basic components that we just talked about, go outside and get an idea of what exists and what your landscape needs or should be enhanced. Should you focus on food resources, or are you lacking nesting habitat areas? Are you lacking shelter or overwintering areas? Some of this can be done by just walking around and using your general knowledge of what wildlife needs. But there are some things online, like Xerces has a nice habitat assessment form that you can use. And it goes into a little more detail looking at your site. The primary purpose of these assessments is to help you prioritize your habitat components at your site. It can point out the components that are missing or in low quality at your site. And so it can help you in your planning. It's something that I recommend as you go out and about. I try to do this as much as possible, and I think a lot of designers do this as well. It's just a good way to keep up, but always take a notepad, always make drawings, always keep your thoughts down and use that when you sit back down to develop your ideas and to establish your thoughts on what needs to go where. One of the things I also want to recommend as you move forward with this is at these early stages establishing a budget for trying to create pollinator habitat on your area. And we'll talk about that a little bit more at length in a bit. This one little diagram is kind of nice, and it's a basic overview of what pollinator habitat could look like. Number one, and you're going to hear me use the term structure a lot today. Structure basically is just the diversity on the landscape. Structure can be done in just planting, whereas you have different plant growth habits and characteristics. And then as you go out from there, structure can increase from shelter in areas. You just want different heights, different types. And that's what I mean when I say structure today. So as you look at that diagram, you notice all the structure. There's tall trees, there's medium growing shrubs, there's low grasses, there's clumps. So it's got a little bit of everything going there. And that's what you're going to want to look at on your site. So once you've looked at your area, and I'm going to break this down into food resources, nesting, sheltering, and water today. If you've looked at your site, and it appears that food resources are the lacking feature, let's go into that component and see exactly what it takes to get that on your landscape. A couple of things to keep in mind. If you find that food resources are lacking at your site, there are several things to think about when you're planning your pollinator food plot. I like using that term. We always hear wildlife food plots where people think of deer and grazing animals, but pollinator food plots are no different. It's just creating a food resource area for those pollinators. Some of the most important things as we walk through these next few steps of establishing food resources on your site or a pollinator food plot. Number one is native plants. Now, I'm not going to tell you that every plant on your landscape has to be native, and I'm not a purist by any means. I do try, however, even in my own yard, to do as many native plants as possible. The native pollinators is what I'm primarily focused on. And so those native plants and those native pollinators have evolved together for millions of years. So it's good to incorporate as many native plants into your landscape as possible. Another thing is consistent blooms. As you are doing your planning for food, you want to make sure you have species that are blooming throughout the year. We have some tools in a minute that we'll talk about that can help you plan on that. When I was talking about structure a few minutes ago, we talked about varied floral characteristics. That should include grasses as well. A lot of the native grasses are clumping type grasses. When they do produce their flowers, their pollen has a really high nutrient content, but those clump grasses are really important and make great nesting habitat, especially for bees. So it's always important to include and think about grasses as you're looking over your landscape. Host plants are important. And for those that don't quite know what host plants are, those are plants that support pollinators in their larval and pupal forms. The best example is milkweed. Monarch caterpillars need milkweed to eat, and that is their primary and really only host plant. So they have to have milkweed to lay their eggs on. And then lastly, an important thing to think about in your area is trees and shrubs and incorporating those into your plan. Shrubs are nice in that they can stay small if you do have height limitations or things that you need to look at. The most important thing with trees and shrubs is that they are early bloomers. Most bloom really early in the spring. And from experience and just spending a lot of time out doing pollinator surveys and looking at pollinator habitat, one of the hardest components to get into your landscape is early blooming plants. That's one of the biggest things that's missing in pollinator food sources early in the season when they're first coming out of overwintering and they need food. They're low on nutrients and they're trying to get ready to lay eggs or to nest. So those are really important, and I can't stress those enough. And we'll talk about some species and stuff in a little bit. Whether or not you just want to expand the amount of food resources on your site or you're looking at other things you need to do, it's good to take an overall picture and to keep these things on the back of your mind as you're looking at it. I know I kind of breezed through that because I'm about to get to a little more detail on actually establishing pollinator food plots. But before I get any farther, I just wanted to ask, and I'm talking a little quick today, and I apologize for that. Again, this is so much information that I want to try to get through it. But does anyone have any questions so far?
Brian, we had one question on the impact of properly applied, like according to label, of Roundup to weeds, and then they specified Johnson grass. So maybe you could address that in general on herbicides.
I have a slide come up in a little bit where we discuss some of that, but just really quick, I don't mind answering that question at this point. I am not against the use of herbicides if they are used appropriately and paying attention to weather conditions. One of the things I really try to do, because we do, even at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, maybe a surprise to a lot, we use glyphosate, especially when we're on large sites. A lot of times, and we'll talk about this in a minute, in prepping sites for planting pollinator habitat, glyphosate is really one of the best tools we have for eliminating non-native plant growth. Johnson grass and things, glyphosate works good on that. I do try to work around as much as possible, whether it be timing or seasonal, when pollinators are on the landscape, to apply those herbicides. So whether it's early in the morning before things come out, or a lot of the cool season grasses like fescue and things like that actually turn green really early in the spring, really late in the winter before most pollinators are on the landscape. So as far as fescue and things, I'll apply that in February sometimes before anything's even come out. So it's a good tool. I recommend it spot spraying. Low volume and low dose is good whenever you need to do it during the season. I don't really recommend a whole lot of broadcast spraying during the summer, but sometimes it is necessary. And a lot of times it is going on species that a lot of the pollinators aren't visiting anyway. There are studies out there, and I'm not downplaying those. We can have that discussion.
Yeah. Any plants to avoid, like tropical milkweed?
You know, I'm not going to say there's a need to avoid it. Again, I'm not a purist. There are some people out there who really want you to focus on nothing but native species. It will provide pollen and nectar for pollinators, but there are so many native milkweed species that I think are equally beautiful in their own right. So I say go with those just because a lot of these native pollinator species have adapted and evolved with the protein and amino acids. Those are your two primary nutrients that are in the pollen that a lot of pollinators are collecting, especially bees. So they've adapted to the contents that are in your native plants.
Okay.
Whenever possible, use the native plants, but I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong or bad and not helping pollinators by using non-natives. A great example too, we put Mexican sunflowers all around our house in the summer. It's one of the best things in the fall for monarch feeding. They absolutely love them. It's not native, but they are pretty, they grow good, they grow easy, they put out lots of flowers, so there's lots of food. Yeah, so that's kind of where I go with that.
Yeah, I love it. That's a great plant too. Okay, one more just really quickly. What about something ubiquitous like white clover? A lot of people are actually seeding that into their lawns now.
I would recommend that over fescue or any of the grasses any day. I have actually gotten into major arguments with people within the service because I recommend clover on sites. A lot of times, going back to my energy side of things, I work with solar installers and trying to put pollinator habitat on solar sites. And a lot of times under the panel, you have plants that are growing a foot or 2 feet tall. So what we do on those sites is we'll seed clover into those. It stays low. It's still a low maintenance plant, but it provides a large amount of pollen and food resources for pollinators. They absolutely love clover. So I'm a proponent of clover in places where you need low plants, and especially in place of, again, non-native grasses, which provide zero benefit.
Okay, great.
Let's move on. We're going to look at establishing some pollinator food plots. And one of the things that I first want to throw out, and I'm not meaning to throw this out to turn anybody off. If anything, I'm throwing it out as maybe a challenge. I talk to so many people about establishing pollinator food plots at their site. And after we get through it all, some people are really kind of wide-eyed because it can be some work. There's some work that's put into it. It generally takes a fair amount of effort. And the biggest thing above all, and this is what I personally have the biggest problem with, is it takes patience. You know, you're playing Mother Nature in this point. You're trying to create natural habitats that once were predominant on the landscape, but that are gone. So you're playing Mother Nature. You're trying to do it. Mother Nature's work is not easy. So you have to be patient and you have to really work with your site. One of the things I've found as I've been doing this is that every site is different. So one of the first things that I asked that is important for you to do after you've gone on, you've done a pollinator habitat assessment, you see you need food resources, one of the first things you need to do is look at what are the qualities of your site that you're wanting to establish this pollinator food plot. Is it sunny? Is it shady? Does it hold moisture? What's the soil type? Is it clay? Is it really sandy? You know, all of those things are important again, and take these notes down. And when you go back and sit down, all of these things are going to be put together to help you develop a plan for what is going on your landscape. And just because it is shady, don't think that you can't do pollinator habitat on that. There are lots of opportunities and also lots of plants that are pollinator friendly plants that are shade tolerant. So you're never down and out. There's always ways to work with it. So quality assessment of your site prep, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other things in just a second, but site prep is going to be probably the most important that we'll go into, and then planting, and then site management. As I was just saying, your site quality analysis is going to look at sunlight and soil, moisture levels. One of the biggest things that I really throw this slide up there for is the wildlife concerns. One of the things I've found is if you've got a lot of rabbits and a lot of deer, there are some plants that they are just going to eat up. There are plants, and we have lists I'll show you in a little bit, that are really good to put in those landscapes. Deer and rabbits don't eat them as much. And I will say this too, sometimes you just never know. I've got purple coneflower all around my house and nothing ever touches it for eating it. But I did a garden in town, and I cannot grow purple coneflower there to save my life because the rabbits just take it to the ground every time. And I've never seen rabbits eat it. It's either a rabbit or a groundhog anyway. There are lots of things to think about. And then one of the other things, if you are in a neighborhood, I run into this sometimes, is the aesthetics. And we'll talk about this because you have options with the aesthetics on what type of pollinator food plot you might want to develop. So it's always something to keep in mind. So site prep. This is going to be one of the biggest things that you can do to increase the potential for success with your pollinator food plot. From experience in doing this for years now, it's not like establishing your vegetable garden or something like that. Depending on the type of food plot you put in, site prep can be a little less egregious, but for the most part, you really need to clean the site to have a success, to really ensure a successful pollinator food plot. There's several ways to do that. You can use solarization, which is basically laying plastic out over a site. That typically needs to be out through a growing season. Again, we're getting back to the patience side of this. Site prep is really one of the biggest things that requires patience. All of these measures really take about an entire growing season to get your site prepped. And to give you an idea, when the Spaniards first came over in the 1500s, they wrote about the entire central area of the state and areas in the mountains, but on smaller scale, being open grasslands and savanna. They called it savanna. On all their old maps, it was labeled as savanna. And so there were lots of these native plants that grew, and all of those plants are fire dependent. They're all disturbance related species. So they need disturbance in order to move into an area and grow. Now, before people, there would have been fire from lightning strikes. There would have been beavers along creeks that dammed them up and flooded areas and killed things off. And then the beaver would die and the dam would go away and then those areas would be grown out. You have to think about those in your site prep mechanism, whichever one you use. You're trying to establish a clean slate on a site, just like fire or flooding would do. So solarization to kill off anything that plastic needs to be laid out, and clear plastic, by the way, is better than black plastic. It allows for the sunlight to come through and it will allow for a lot of the seed in the top inches of the soil to germinate. But once those plants start to sprout, the temperature is hot enough through it underneath the plastic that it'll kill those. So clear plastic is recommended over black plastic. And then another way is sod cutting. This is a pretty labor intensive method. You can rent sod cutters at most tool rental places. It's about $100 for a day. It does a great job. We'll talk about some of the pros and cons on this in a second, but the big thing with sod cutting is that you lose a top layer of topsoil because you have to set that cutter deep enough to cut the roots out of the grass. I will say it works best in sites that are kind of just a lawn, like you see in the picture here. That's when it is probably the most functional. I will say I was battling monkey grass on a site. This was just a small garden, so thankfully it wasn't like a half acre or acres. But spraying, no matter what, I could not get the monkey grass out. Luckily at this site, it had been mulched for years and years and years. And so there was a really nice deep layer of good soil there. And finally, I just threw in the towel and rented a sod cutter to see if I could cut most of that monkey grass out. And it worked. I still get a few sprigs in that particular garden, but I had to cut it out pretty deep. And I will say it was a lot of work because you get these really thick mats of dirt and roots basically, but it got rid of monkey grass. So if you have a small area of monkey grass, it's another option for that. Another one is rototilling, what you would do for a vegetable garden. It does require tilling several times through the year. Anytime you start getting another sprouting of seeds, it's good to go till those back up. And you're just trying to, again, clean that site through tilling. And then lastly, what we discussed a little bit ago is herbicide treatment. It's back and forth. It's a preference. There are pros and cons to it. Again, sometimes we're dealing with acres of invasive plants and we don't have enough labor. It would take us years and years and years to even start to make a dent. And so there's no way that we can do it by hand. And on those sites, sometimes we will do large broadcast treatments of herbicide. And I'm speaking again back to some of my solar sites. We're talking about 15, 20 acres sometimes. And it is in strips, but it's still multiple acres of planting that we're going to want to do on those. So we will use herbicide treatment. So it's going to be a personal preference, what you feel safe with using. Solarization is just as good. But I will say the one thing with herbicide treatment, you're guaranteed a pretty good kill. But even with that, one thing I've learned is that you should plan on a spraying of at least twice in a year before you consider your bed properly prepped for pollinator food resources. So all of these, and again, it gets back to patience, all of these take at least a year to get your site developed. And again, I can't stress site prep enough. It is the number one most important thing that you're going to do to your site to ensure success. Once you have your site nice and prepped, it comes down to planting. Now, going back to your plans and the notes you've taken and the things that are going to be there, you do have some options when it comes to planting. Really, the two main options, though, are using transplants or potted plants or plugs, or spreading a native seed mix on that site. There's a lot of seed mixes on the market. You can buy them pre-mixed. We'll talk about some species again in a minute. Some of those seed mixes are kind of expensive. They're cheaper on a large scale than using transplants, but they're still expensive in their own right. But one way you can get those costs down is by creating your own customized mix. And that's either working through a company or just buying individual seeds and mixing them together. You can reduce the number of species in a seed mix sometimes, and it will save you some money when you're going through seed distributors. We talked about having blooming species through the seasons. One of the things that we typically recommend is having at least 3 native species blooming in each season. And for the most part, if you go through the list that we'll look at, you're going to have species that overlap. And that's really what you want. You just don't want there to be a long period of time where there's no food on the landscape. And this goes back to a lot of the plants that you get that are not native. You know, you go to the Home Depot or garden center, most of those plants are only going to bloom in the summer. And actually, most of them don't really have very good pollinator qualities anyway. Most of them are made to bloom in the summer. You don't get the early spring bloomers, and you don't have things that are carrying through into the early fall. So make sure you have species that are blooming. Looking at grasses, you want to keep those. If you are buying plants from box stores, one of the most important things you need to look at is to make sure that those plants are not pre-treated. A lot of them are, believe it or not. They're pre-treated with neonics sometimes and insecticides, and that's not a good thing for your garden. I have a link there to Asheville Greenworks pollinator plant and native list. There's a host of information on that site. I recommend going to that and looking through. I was lucky enough to be on a task force. Phyllis Stiles, she was wanting to, for the Greenworks site, to create a localized native plant list. You get a lot of plant lists, and basically it'll be regional. It'll be Southeast or Southern Appalachian or Mid-Atlantic or something like that. But hardly ever do they really get down to a localized level. And so she convened this task force. I was lucky enough to be invited on that. Most of the people in there were way above my knowledge with just plants. So it was a learning experience for me. But those lists are on that site. And on those lists, it has plants, it has their bloom times, it has what nurseries carry them, it has their characteristics, how tall or short they grow, what pollinators it helps, whether they're shade tolerant or sunny. There are really some expansive lists available on that site. One of the things that I often am asked is, which one do I prefer, transplants or seeding? There's pros and cons to each one. And really, you're going to have to weigh what you've got going on. For small gardens, I'm saying anything 30 by 30, 20 by 20, something like that, you know, several hundred square feet. Typically, transplants are going to be your best bet. But I do have some lists here of things to keep in mind when you're looking at transplants versus seeding. Transplanting plants, it is more expensive. But one thing about that is that you can use potted plants. Most pollinator plants, you can plant almost throughout the summer into the fall. I typically put things in the fall to catch some things on sale or something like that. And they do just as well as things planted earlier in the season. You do have more control. And what I mean by that is you know where plants are going to be. So you can plan out your garden. Whereas when you use a seed mix, you're looking at kind of what those pictures show there. You're looking at more of what I call a natural area. It's going to be kind of messy looking, but that's really what a native meadow, more of what it would have looked like. Now, is one any better than the other? If you use transplants and you plant your garden properly, I'm not going to say one is any better than the other. But sometimes the native meadows do have a little better habitat, a little better structure to them. They have the different height plants there. It's a little thicker. There's good shelter. and nesting sites typically down in these things. I have a couple of little mini meadows at my house here, and one of them right now, even the coreopsis just started blooming this morning, which was nice and pretty, but it's about waist high. So you're going to get different structure with those. Maintenance is going to be a little easier with transplants because you can mulch those after planting. Site prep is even more important with seeding because you're really wanting to make sure you don't have a lot of weed growth coming in and overgrowing your seed mixes. But let's take a little bit closer look at each of these and talk about how to go about using transplants in your garden. Again, going back to your plan, this takes it a step further though when you're using transplants. Not only have you picked your site, you've taken the qualities of your site into consideration, but it comes time to plan out. You have the opportunity to plan where you want color, where you want structure, where you want things to grow. And I'm speaking to the choir here, I know through the Master Gardeners program. Think about that structure. Think about the back of your garden being the taller plants and then moving to shorter things in the front. And one thing I will say, when you're using transplants, it's good to plant species in clumps. And the reason for that is that they will be able to grow together and you'll have a better looking garden your first year. It'll help them to grow together and create that space for that species. I've done this both ways. And again, and this comes back to your budget, but whether you plant them densely or sparsely, either one works, especially if you're mulching your garden and you're going to be going in and pulling unwanted weeds. Okay, but the more densely you plant it, the more natural it's going to look quicker. It's going to be a little more expensive, obviously, but that is what you want. And I know it's kind of a cartoon drawing rendition here, but that's what you're going for. You're wanting all these plants to grow together. Again, back to that, using transplants, but creating that native meadow look, which is really densely populated. If you do plant those plants sparse, keep your unwanted weeds pulled, they will spread on their own and get to this level, but it does take a couple of years. And typically, if you plant them sparse, you're looking at a good 2 to 3 years at least before they really have a chance to grow together. So plant them as densely as you can and you'll have a better looking garden quicker. I'll give you some cost estimates on transplants. It can be upwards of around $5 or so if you're doing all the work yourself, $5 or so a square foot. That'll give you an idea of what you're looking at for a transplanted pollinator food plot using all plants you purchase. I also like to say that typically when you're doing the seeding, we'll talk about in a second, but you don't want to water those. But with transplants, you've bought those plants, they're already established and you know where they are. You want to make sure and at least give those plants a little bit of water during the first growing season, or at least through the hottest part of the growing season. You spend a lot of money on those. Typically, it's going to be $5 to $10 a plant. So you want to save those. Go ahead and water those and keep them going. And also add mulch just to help keep the weed competition down. I have something at the bottom there, and it's something I do use sometimes in planning out gardens. You don't have to have an expensive program to put these together. What I use there is an Excel spreadsheet, and you can go in and you can even put it to scale and drawing out your plants. But you can see on this particular site that I did, there was about 110 or so plants in that site. It's right at about 2,000 square feet. So it was not as densely planted as the plan there looks, but it should get to that point. Plant costs and things on that one ran about $1,000. So that'll give you an idea of how that went. I used an Excel spreadsheet and put color coding to the species. There's great planning tools you can use out there even without having expensive programs.
Hey, Brian, just really quickly, somebody asked if you could just
Sure.
define dense planting. Again, is that closer than what they'll reach at maturity?
Good question. What I mean by that is, and every plant is going to have a different characteristic. Let's take a black-eyed Susans. It's a simple one. They're perennial. They're going to come back. They're going to eventually grow out and have a spread of about 2 feet. They can get big. But when I say dense planting, if I was putting those in the first year, and typically the recommendations for black-eyed Susan would be to plant them about 18 inches apart. I might squeeze that down to a foot. And that way, that first year, again, you're going to have a big, thick looking clump that looks like one plant. And then over the years, it's going to spread out even bigger from there. But that's what I mean by dense planting, is maybe cutting the recommended planting distance by maybe a third to a half even on some. Seeding. The thing with seeding, again, back to the prep, you want a really clean site. And seeding can be done either by hand spreading, broadcasting. I have a belly spreader here, a picture of one. Sometimes they work, but they're really not the best option. I recommend just broadcasting by hand. If you have a really big site, you see the picture of the tractor there, we use a no-till drill. And on really big sites, that's the only way to do it. It's hard to hand broadcast much over a third of an acre or so. It's hard to make it even. But when I start approaching half acre to an acre, I'm going to start looking at bringing in equipment sometimes. And there are availabilities for those of you on the presentation today who have large areas. You can rent, if you have a tractor, you can rent no-till drills from your local soil and water conservation office. Henderson County is an example I'll give out. If you rent from them, the farmer that has the drill actually comes to your site with it. He brings it. He does the planting for you. And the last time, it's been a few years now, but it was right at about $100 an hour or something like that. So it's not bad when you think about planting a large area with seed. As I said earlier, there's custom seed mixes or pre-made mixes. You can custom make some. The biggest thing though, if you have a small site and you want to seed it after you've prepped it, when it's time to plant these seeds, which is typically in the winter, December to February is the best time to plant. Scratch the top inch of soil, mix your seeds with a little cat litter or sand, and then using the broadcast throwing method, make sure you go over your area, and then you want to cross back over those in the other direction once you've gone horizontal one way and then come back vertical the other. Once you've got your seed broadcasted, just lightly rake it so that it's in. If you have a roller, it's nice. You don't want to make it really heavy, but just enough to kind of press those soils. You don't really want to push them down into the ground because most of the seeds are really small, but you want to make sure they're in contact with the soil. So roll or step those seeds in. And again, no need to water it. A lot of times when you water, all you're doing is helping the weeds grow and giving them some sprouting time as well. And that's not what you're wanting to do. So that's the two planting methods. Whether you're developing seed mixes or you're using transplants, one of the biggest questions I get all the time, what's a list of plants that you can use? And it's really hard to do because there are so many. But I try to put together the plants that, and this list right here, they are by far the easiest to grow, especially in transplants and seeds, to be honest with you. They grow easy, they're easy to manage, they expand, sometimes maybe even a little too easy, but they are good pollinator plants. They have high pollinator qualities, and they are some of the easiest ones to get started if you're new to gardening, if it's your first time, or even if you're just wanting to get a site that's in your yard and you don't really care if it's 8 or 10 species. It doesn't have to be perfect. I recommend putting these in and let them go and see what they do, but they'll take over a little site very easily. And again, typically provide lots of blooms for pollinators. So the last part of planting is the management. And this is something that people really get maybe confused on, but it's really one of the easiest. And it does take some assessment. You have to keep an eye on it, especially the seeded areas where it's growing really thick. At the end of each season, you're going to want to mow those down in the wintertime. Now, the good thing about them is that these areas, you don't usually touch them during the growing season. That's the one greatest thing about them. You can take over a lawn area that you had to mow once or twice a week, you seed it, and then you're down to only mowing it once a year. For the first year or so, though, it might take a little bit of extra maintenance, whether it's hand pulling or even spot spraying on some stuff. I know I get Bermuda grass into some spots sometimes, and that's a tough one. And spraying doesn't always get it, but I really try to hit that with some spot spray, a glyphosate during the summer, being really careful to not get it on other plants. But for the most part, as your pollinator garden establishes, you mow that down in the wintertime. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. You want to replicate fire going over the landscape. So when fire burns through something, you're not going to have a lot of cut debris and things laying on top of those plants. Most of your native plants are not going to like that, and you're going to get very poor regrowth or germination of new seeds for the next year. So if you mow it and you don't have a mulch, you want to set the mower height as high as possible, or go through with a string trimmer or a sling blade. And you want to rake off all your cut material if you don't have a mulching mower that you can set at a higher level. Use a sling blade string trimmer and rake off your cut material at the end after you're done. You want to leave that site clean. At that time, in the winter time, after you've done that, you can even take some of that spent material and make sure the seeds have been distributed out of it. You can throw it on some sides of your yard, see if it grows. But you could also use some of the seed you purchased and reseed or do transplants into some of those areas as well. If you have really large areas, I'm just throwing this in there. If there is anybody out there with really large sites, one of the best tool you can have, or that we have for maintaining native habitats, is fire. And you can work with the state Forest Service in developing fire plans for your site. Depending on your objectives, they can help you out with that. And even if it's a small plot, if you live out in the county, you have a lot of spent material on it, if you can get fire to run through it, that is the number one best thing to do.
Brian, really quickly, somebody asked a question about ratio of grasses to perennials and annuals. Do you have a thought about that?
What we've done in the past is we've gone as high as 60% grasses and 40% forbs. We've seen a lot of sites that we've planted, especially in the Piedmont, when we've used that ratio. After the first couple of years, they will look really nice and have a lot of forbs and a lot of flowers, a lot of blooms. And then by the third year, they typically are turning over to a native grass. I've had landowners that weren't real happy with that. It's still native species and native grasses, but they wanted some pretty flowers. My answer to them oftentimes is, well, maybe this site is supposed to be native grasses and it's evolving into what it wants to be. If you look back again at what a lot of the Spanish explorers wrote about, they called them savannas, and though there were a lot of native forbs that we know about in there, they were predominantly grassland. So that's one thing. I do have landowners, and even my cohorts at the state, they're doing some plantings down in the Sandhill area, and they're cutting back on those grass percentages. So it really depends on what you're going for. I still personally stick to the 60-40 rule, 60% grasses to 40% forbs.
One more question on this management slide. When you talk about mowing or cutting back old growth in late winter, once it's established, would that be an annual plan?
That's an annual plan. And typically, again, you want to do that in November, December for several reasons. These native stands are creating great nesting and sheltering areas, not only for insects, but for birds. So you're not wanting to disturb any of the wildlife that's using this. So wait until the winter when everything's off the landscape. Number two, you also want the seeds from the plants that you've grown to mature and fall out and be available for germinating in the next growing season. So give it time. One of the biggest reasons to me as well is I like the look of it. I like all the structure and the different seed heads that are on the plants into the winter. To me, it's nothing prettier, something natural, really supernatural about that to me that I like. But yes, it's an annual thing. Do it in the winter.
Now, you said late winter.
Well, anywhere from December to February. Winter anymore has taken on new meanings.
Yeah.
February is almost getting too late anymore for some things that we used to. But the second part of our pollinator habitat that I wanted to look at today is our shelter. I broke that down into nesting and overwintering areas. Nesting and sheltering habitat, about 70% of North America's native bee species are ground nesters. So it's important to leave exposed areas of ground for these species to burrow into and create their nests. Most of these are solitary bees, so they're not living in big hives. So exposed ground is important. About 30% of native bees nest in wood tunnels. So some of the crazy things you hear about leaving stumps in your yard or leaving piles of debris. A lot of times are for these mason bees and solitary bees that nest in wood structures. Some other things that we've already talked about, again, creating that structure on the landscape, not only creating food resources, but habitat or those bunch grasses. It's a great nesting area and sheltering area. Wood pile, debris piles, and also large rocks. A lot of bees will nest under rocks. One of the biggest things you can do on your landscape is create hedgerows if you have space. Now, these can be large or small. They don't have to be expansive, massive landscape features, but hedgerows are really great features to meet all the habitat requirements, food and shelter. They support some of the largest, highest diversity and communities of beneficial insects than any other landscape feature. I wanted to talk a little bit about native hedgerow creation. It consists of diversity of plants. Recommendations typically run anywhere from 30 feet wide to 60 feet wide. You just want multiple layers of plants. And hedgerows, they're the ultimate multitaskers on the landscape. They provide numerous benefits. They prevent erosion, cut down on wind. They help hold moisture in sites because they are eliminating some of the wind out of it. Perhaps most importantly, they provide structure, that one word that we keep coming back to on the landscape. Not only is it good for pollinators, it's super good for birds. A lot of our early successional bird species that are really disappearing on the landscape as well really like these hedgerows. Farm habitats, it's really important to put these in because of the amount of diversity of beneficial insects they attract. Studies have shown that there's about a 10 to 20% increase in harvests at intensive farms that incorporate hedgerows and strip growth of pollinator habitats. So native hedgerow creation, if you've got a small site, you can go down to 6 feet. That's getting kind of tight. 20 feet is really good. Wider is obviously better. You want to have multiple rows, different heights of species. It doesn't have to be tall trees. You can always incorporate shrubs. You want to stagger those. I mentioned densely planting earlier for an aesthetic reason. With hedgerows, you want to do it. That is what a hedgerow is. You want to put trees and shrubs 6 to 8 feet apart and in rows about 8 to 10 feet apart, whereas you would typically grow those 15 to 20 feet apart, especially some of the trees. So think about densely planting, lay out a plan. If you do have a strip area, these things work so much better than privacy fencing or screens from roads or things that you're not wanting to see. They don't have to be that expensive to implement. You can use bare root. Buncombe County Soil and Water has a bare root tree sale in the spring every year. You could almost get enough species from that sale to create a really nice hedgerow just using bare roots. It's going to take a couple of years. But again, back to that whole patience. The prepping comes down to very similar to what you do for any of the food pollinator plots. You can also mulch these areas to help you keep some unwanted growths down. Some recommendations for plants, typically hawthorn, sumac, hydrangea, dogwood, shrubby St. John's wort, viburnums, buttonbush. You want to step those things down to some of your forbs that you're growing, then into some of the native grasses, and down to lower growing plants. Again, you're looking at that multifaceted, multi-height structure. Plant closer, 75% of the suggested spacing. So much more dense for hedgerows than for the food plots. Overwintering, you see a lot of crazy suggestions, not raking leaves and things like that. The reason is there's a number of moth species, even Luna moths and Io moths, that will lay their eggs. And also the pupae will stay in leaf matter over the winter. And just so you see, it's really hard to tell the difference. That is a Luna moth pupae there in its cocoon. So hard to tell. Another big thing you can do is cleaning non-native invasives. Again, back to the loss of ephemeral spring flowers on the landscape. It's really because of this overgrowth in forested areas. So any places you can clean up are great. Leaving brush piles, creating structure, and multiple blooming hollow stemmed plants is a very important thing. A lot of solitary bees lay their eggs in hollow stems to overwinter. So it's important to keep those. If you do need to cut some of your old spent growth, just pile it up on the side of the yard so that those larvae can still grow, come out, and be adults on the landscape. The last thing for our pollinator habitat is water. Now, of course, we don't all need big, nice streams on our property or really huge water features. It really doesn't come down to that at all. Any little bowl, dish, a puddle, there's umpteen things you can look up online for how to create water features in your garden. One thing to keep in mind is that most of your native pollinators are not really far ranging. They don't go a long ways. Honeybees, they'll travel for miles for food, or up to a mile. But a lot of the native bees don't travel that far. They don't really like to leave the food. So having water resources near food plots is important, but there's lots of ways to do it. The main thing is to give rocks and things in that so that the water can be shallow. You won't drown bees. You want to give some areas for bees to be able to climb out of. Now, the most important thing, we stress this with other wildlife, and it's been a long known important philosophy, but connectivity and consistency across a landscape. So even with pollinators, just like with any wildlife, we've got to start thinking beyond just our yard, working with our community, working with neighboring commercial developments, working with industrial developments. So many of these industrial developments have acres of planted grass around there. Nobody even goes out there. So not only are they wasting time and money and polluting to cut the grass, when they could just plant pollinator habitat. But a lot of times it comes down to education, knowledge, and having people to work with them. So what I want to stress with this is think outside your yard. Just because you don't have a nice sunny area in your yard to grow a really diverse habitat or pollinator food plot, maybe your neighbor does. Maybe you have a nice little wooded section that you just need to clean out the invasive and try to give some nesting and overwintering areas. But your neighbor has that nice sunny spot. Maybe your other neighbor has a pond or good areas for water resources. So just think about things outside of the little area that you're looking at. The main thing, again, you're trying to create structure and diversity, and you're wanting abundance of resources on the landscape. Now, some other actions: create no-mow areas in your yard, non-natives, getting rid of those, avoid insecticides especially, but pesticides, try to limit it as much as possible. Light pollution is another one. Watch your light pollution on your landscape. It does affect pollinators, your nocturnal pollinators. Certifying your pollinator garden once you get these things done. There's national level with the Xerces Society. There's also local level through Asheville Greenworks. They have a pollinator habitat certification program. The links are there and you can get those online. There's different tiers to it, and there is a small fee to get the sign. Tools and resources. This is a list of things that Allison has available to everyone. There's links on there to a little bit of everything that we talked about today. Hopefully this gave you some good information and will help you get ready to establish some pollinator habitat on your landscape.
Thank you, Brian. There's Brian's contact information. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. We have upcoming programs coming in June. I want everybody just to be aware of and look forward to seeing you. You can visit this website, buncombecountymastergardener.org, for those events that are coming up. And we just want to thank you, Brian, and thank everybody for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks everybody. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. I love helping folks out, and depending on what you got going, I don't mind doing through pictures over the internet or sometimes even making some site visits, and we can talk about what you've got going on or would like to get on your property.